We are all in for a treat today. We're about to learn everything we ever wanted to know about the history of Carnival from none other than Louis McWilliams, who is the artistic director of the Malik Folk Performing Company and also a lecturer at the Center for Creative and Festival Arts at the University of the West Indies. So if there was ever a man to ask a question to, it is Mr. McWilliams. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and I really hope that I can do justice to all the accolades I just got. So
I'm sure. We want to start at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I've grown up here and I have a certain understanding of Carnival, but unfortunately I haven't studied it in the way you have. If you could take us back to give us some sort of understanding of the root of it. Where did it come from? And then we'll go through the evolution.
I think if one has to go, one has to go probably as far back as emancipation. And when the slaves, African slaves, received emancipation, that was a reason for celebration. And that Emancipation Proclamation caused the slaves to venture out, to begin to celebrate. And it began to be celebrated annually. Okay? It began to be celebrated annually. And it continued for a while, and until one of the major turning points was the Cambay riots, when Captain Baker tried to stop the slaves and the procession. And there was a big battle with Captain Baker. And the stick fighters, the batoniers, the Jamets, all people who were involved had this major clash with Captain Baker. And it caused one of the historical turning points, the Cambay riots. And that to me is where the thing really began to happen. And then Cambay too was celebrated with emancipation in August. And then they moved it to just prior to the Lenten season where we have it now. Right? And with that whole sense of procession and celebration taking to the streets continued. During that period, coming out of that period was the whole element of the stick fighting. That was one of the prominent factors that time. And in and around Port-au-Prince and different parts of Trinidad and Tobago, you had what was called the yards, the stick fight yards. And all of these stick fight yards had their resident chantwell and their resident people, and they would take to the streets with their drums and that kind of stuff. And then, the drums were banned. Once the drums were banned, what happened? We had to find another way of expressing ourselves. So they took away the drums. What do we do? Now, when you had the drums playing, and the African drums, there were three basic types of drums that were being played. You had what is called the cutter, which is the high-pitched drum. You had the bass drum, and you had what is called the fule, or the rhythm drum. So when the drums were banned, as a resourceful people, and because we're resilient, we resorted to cutting bamboo. Tambu bamboo came into place. Right. And just to explain, tambu bamboo coming from the patois, tambu, drum, bamboo, to become the bamboo drum. So when you hear tambu bamboo, it's not just a word, it has meaning, bamboo drum.
And then when you talked about after the Cambay riots and moving Carnival to where it exists now, the 2 days before Lent, how is that related? Why choose those 2 days? How is the Lenten season or Catholicism related to Carnival celebrations?
There are a lot of stories about that. People look at the whole thing about Carnival and look at the Latin meaning coming out of it, where there was a Lenten season, and which was very much farewell to meat. And you talk in Latin, carne, vale, farewell to meat. And people make that association between Carnival. And I think the authorities felt that was a good time to have this thing. So it moved away from being an Emancipation Day procession to taking to the streets on these 2 days of the year. Because after the riots, the governor actually came into Port-au-Prince and allowed the people to have their celebrations. So the 2 days, Carnival Monday and Tuesday, has remained with us since then.
Now, you mentioned certain characters as well. Tell me about some of those. You talked about a Jamet. What was that?
Yeah. Well, the Jamet was, nowadays when we say Jamet, we think of the bad woman. But the Jamet in earlier days was like underworld. Again, it comes from the French diamètre, which is diameter, lying on the border. So we had the Jamet women who were very instrumental in the calendar yards. They were the ones responsible for keeping the calendar alive. And a lot of times the stickmen would fight for them. They were the real bad ones. They were the terrors, The stick fighters I mean, they had their sticks and stuff, but the women in that period, were the really strong ones, you know. A lot of the characters we have and the things we have today are all derivatives from that. I mean, look at Cambay. I mean, we talk about Cambay all the time. It comes from the French can brûlé, burnt cane.
Because the Africans would have worked in sugarcane fields.
Yes, and that was one of the ways of celebrating, you know, the emancipation. It was a form of celebration and revolt also. Coming out of that, one of the early characters would have been the Jab Molassie, which was the molasses devil, which again has that connotation with the burning of the cane and the molasses and that kind of stuff. They would paint, they would cover themselves in molasses and recreate that whole thing about the Jab Molassie, because I mean you always had this connotation that God is white, the devil is black, you know, and they would play on that, you know. So they took on that, they created that character, the Jab Molassie. Then you had characters coming out of that too in that period. Apart from the Jab Molassie, what you found coming out now, you had other traditional characters like Damain, Midnight Robber, the Pero Grenade, which is a takeoff again of the princely Pero. Characters like the Bat, the traditional, we call Black Indian mask, Warahoons, you know.
There were a lot of scary characters. There's imps and devils and dragons.
Mm-hmm.
Why that theme in what is meant to be a celebration of freedom? Why the fear? Why the terror?
Well, one of the things about early traditional characters, when they actually began to come onto the streets, a part of it was trying to recreate history, almost in a mimicking kind of way, portraying how it is they were looked at. People and the colonizers looked at the black people as devils, as you know. So that being ingrained in their whole system became a way of portrayal, release. Like any Carnival has been all about release, and it's a thing about the African slaves and their memory, and that whole passing of oral tradition just remains with us, you know. So that we don't know who will play devil mask, but I mean, like I saw some young kids like 10, 11 playing devil mask, and it's amazing though, because they were not there at the period, you know. They do have a real, I mean, they may not have a real sense of what that mask means to them. But once they cover themselves in the oil and whatever it is, it's a kind of automatic transformation. You don't tell someone who's playing Jab Molassie how to behave, you know. And that was one thing about mask long time, and the power of mask, in that behavior change once you put on the costume. You do not put on a Pero Grenade costume and walk about and unwind. You want to become the Pero. When you put on a sailor costume, you want to be the sailor.
Peter Minshall speaks all the time about playing the mask.
Yeah, about playing in the mask. It's one of the things about the traditional characters. There was always that kind of form which allowed you to play the mask. You go to play a Midnight Robber. It's about language. Let's look at the Damain, for example. You know that parody. The men would do it. And now I'm glad I'm talking about Damain, because now we talk about Damain, and when we look at Damain, there's that perception that Damain is only about the big breasts and the big bottom, you know. But it is much more than that. The Damain and a Carnival Sunday was a ritual, you know. It was a whole dramatic reenactment, you know, when the slaves would put on these costumes and looking at the exaggerated body parts or deformities of their masters and mistresses, and would bring them, and they would have their own parodied masquerade ball, and they would come in, somebody just as the butler, and they'd come in and they'd take on big titles, you know, Mr. and Mistress, depending on their master's name and that kind of stuff, and they would come on.
So these are slave balls.
Yeah, and they would have the slave balls on a Carnival Sunday night, and then later in the night it would get a little bit vulgar, because now then we had what was called the maître. I was a school teacher who would come in and with his roll book and begin to call roll, and the different as he calls the roll, the different characters come out. And apart from, I mean, and all the characters had names, you know, like we see the big breasts, that was Madame Gotete, okay? The big bottom, that was Madame Gobunda. But we also had the big belly, Madame Gobuda. You had characters like Madame Bossi, with the Bossi back.
Okay.
You had Madame Sofoot. You had Monsieur Gololo,
Oh yes, well I know
You
that
know,
one.
you have Monsieur Gololo, you have Madame Tête Fou, you know, Monsieur Genou with the big knee. And so that the Dame Lorraine and these characters, when the Met called them, they would come and really play on the exaggerated parts and that kind of stuff to the traditional music. And one of the nice things about the Dame Lorraine is that the way they flirt between prim and proper, with the fans as though they're very ladylike, to being the vulgar character. And in the traditional sense, the men would play the roles to the hilt, you know. One of the things that comes out a lot in these characters for Juve Morning is the whole sense about making money. You know, you play a mass Juve Morning, it's about making money. The Jab Malasi, it's about making money. The Midnight Robber, he spreads fear and terror in you, you pay him to get away. You want to pay the people, you're going to have to spell. You know, baby doll comes with her doll and looking for her father, and if you sorry for her, she wants help. She needs to buy diapers for the baby. You know, you have characters like Miss Mary. You have a guy with something in a shoebox called Miss Mary. You got to pay money to see Miss Mary. And you put money in, and maybe it's nothing in the shoebox.
Yes.
Or whatever it is, you know. You had characters like Police and Thief, you know, where, I mean, and those days, I mean, Juve was dramatic. I remember as a little child running up and down the road behind Police and Thief.
Yes.
You know, you had things like Dog and Lamppost, Doctor and Nurse, you know, where people took on roles and the thing became very dramatic.
How does somebody play a lamppost?
Well, one person stands in the other person like a dog, and it's
That's
so
an easy
hilarious.
mass
You pay, I mean, and you pay to see it. Even the Moko Jumbies, in traditional times, to when they played very tall, they were able to collect money from people who were looking on from upstairs. But sometimes they would have a long stick with a tin at the bottom to collect money from people on the ground level. And it was all about making money, that familiar chant with the devil, pay the devil. What it did though was bring a sense of interaction.
Yes.
A sense of interaction. And long ago when we talk about street theater, and when we think of theater, we think of that relationship between player and audience. You know, a time when characters had a relationship with the audience and the spectators. You know, and the theater of the Carnival was very prevalent. You know, I guess these days when you look at it, it's a player-player relationship.
Yes.
A lot of the characters were created out of real situations in the day.
To reflect
the sailor became very prominent after World War, when there was the predominance of the young American sailors here in Trinidad. And the local people began to copy their style. You know, began to copy their style, the way they operated. And the sailors in the 1940s were very prominent of a fixture in Trinidad and Tobago. And naturally, it lent itself to the mass developing. People who played mass in the earlier days, that was not just playing mass for playing mass sake. It was something inspirational, something from inside. And you would look, I mean, those guys now, they looked at the sailor from all their facets. The way they walked while they were through town, the kind of different jobs that the sailors did when they were on the ship. I mean, now you have sailors like the mechanic, you have the fireman, you know, sometimes you see the cook, you have the drunken sailor, and then you had one person decided, okay, I'm going to try to create a long nose, you know, and then the creativity of the Trinidad masqueraders now brought out a newer dimension, you know, in terms of the sailor, rather than just seeing the white, you know. And then you had the king sailor, and then even with the sailor, I mean, sailor mask is characterized apart from costuming and movement.
Yes.
Because out of that sailor tradition of mask has come another traditional carnival dance, which is a sailor.
I tried it last year with the Mounto group, and it's a technical thing, man.
Yeah, I remember you.
Yeah.
I remember that.
I mean, is that meant to be the swagger of the Yankee sailor? Where does that come from?
It's the swagger. A lot of it has to do with, I mean, trying to imitate the sailor walking on the boat, you know, and then the advent of the American movie also, because even inside of the sailor, there are like the Charlie Chaplin movements, you know. Now we even have a character called Popeye the Sailor, you know. And again, it's the creativity, looking at one particular theme and drawing on it, and the sailors are improving. I mean, and when people put on a sailor costume to play mass, you have no choice but to want to dance like the sailor. And there's a whole sense of rocking the boat.
Yes.
A whole sense of rocking the boat, you know, hop, skip, and jump,
Yes.
you know. And other movements have names, you know, and that's a mass that is quite interesting and one that's developing still. And I'm always happy when I see more and more people wanting to learn the Sila because it's a form that comes out of tradition.